Where have all the good men gone? This is a question that was recently posed in, of all places, a New York Times article. Yes, apparently there's some lamentations taking place, even among the feminist left, on where are all the good men at? And how, gosh, we really need you guys back, which is fascinating to most of us on the man side of the category, because for the longest time now, we've been told we are the source of all of the evils in the world. But I don't want to mock someone asking an important question, because there are a lot of men, especially young men, that are kind of just exiting stage left. Actually, they're exiting stage right based off of the polling. But if you look at what they're saying, there's actually a term for this, and it's called men going their own way. And so we're going to look into this article. Plus, we're going to look into some other articles that have recently written on this topic. And we're going to ask the question about where have all the good men gone, right? We're also going to ask a very important question that doesn't seem to get asked. What, if anything, potentially drove them away? And what are some of the ideologies that could be behind that? All coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
Then we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines.
Hello.
And special guest, the yin to Christian's yang when it comes to debating all sorts of issues, especially liberalism versus traditionalism, are we going to call it, or just neo-reactionaryism?
We're still trying. That's kind of the problem, right? We're still trying to figure out it.
Our very own from our own community. Andrea, how are you doing today, Andrea?
I'm doing simply stupendous. Thanks for having me.
Well,
as long as nobody mentions the friend-enemy distinction, this should, no hostages should be taken.
Well, I'll tell you right now, one of the things we had to have Andrea on, because every time I use the term modern feminism, Andrea essentially rakes me over the coals in the comments section, clarifying that no, it's not just the modern variant that we have a problem with. And so we decided it would only be appropriate if we brought her on to use her extensive experience and studying, her extensive intellectual prowess on this particular subject. But before we go into that, I want to make everyone aware of the sponsor of today's show, Young America's Foundation. We've actually teamed up with Young America's Foundation, who are responsible for kind of like preserving not only the Reagan Ranch, but much of the Reagan legacy. And they have set up a special program for middle and high school students out in Dixon, Illinois, where you're going to be able to hear from a variety of speakers, to include people like Dr. Ben Carson, Chloe Cole, Seth Dillon, and yes, myself. Even I will be there as well. But other than that, it's still a good place to go and learn. And I'll tell you what, one of the things that I love so much about this particular program is that they really dig into not just lecturing students, right? Students are not just sitting there hearing a variety of lectures. They're actually getting to interact with the speakers. One of the things I like to do is do some mock debates with the students to see if they are actually prepared to be able to defend the values that we all hold dear and the values that Reagan fought so effectively for. So if that is something you're interested in, I want to go over to yaf.org. That's yaf.org/Reagan Summer. All right. Then what you're going to do is you're going to use your discount code NICK25, and you're going to get 25% off the entire thing. Not to mention the fact, if it's a little bit more of a trip for you, maybe it's a little bit more of a haul to Dixon, Illinois, YAF has actually got funds available to be able to help students travel and make it to this event. So please go to yaf.org, yaf.org/Reagan Summer. Use discount code NICK25. You're going to get 25% off those tickets. I look forward to seeing you there. I've already dealt with some of their, I've already interacted with some of their middle school, high school programs, got to speak to the students. It is an incredible program. Incredible program. If you are interested in educating your kids on the principles which are necessary in order to ensure liberty survives, this is a great program to be a part of. Go check it out. All right. So first things first. Our good friends at the New York Times, always famous for their introspection when it comes to analyzing the problems of the modern world, started off with an article, and I can't believe this. The title of it is, "Men, Where Have You Gone? Please Come Back." Wait, what? I thought the future was female and there was no longer any need for us. In fact, we were part of the problem. So what gives, ladies?
Can I point one thing out just really quick? It says so many men have retreated from intimacy, hiding behind firewalls, filters, and curated personas. Has anyone opened Instagram lately to look at the women and all of the curated personas? And the fact that you can't even see a real woman anymore. They all have a freaking filter, especially like there's some in politics where you wouldn't even know it's the same person if you met them in person.
Well, there's
So,
that.
wow. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of like, hey,
Well, no,
pot,
I
calling
have-
the kettle black here.
I have a feeling as we go through this article, we're going to get a lot of questions that would probably get some answers if people stopped long enough to listen to what men actually have to say. But Christian, Andrea, take us through this. What do we need to know about this article?
So we're not going to read the entire thing, but I highly recommend if you get the chance to read it, because this is just a masterclass in completely missing the point.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, there is no introspection of, oh, what could have been driving men away from social spaces? For example, at the start of this article, it's basically a story of, I'm going to bars and restaurants and I'm seeing all these women everywhere and there's no men anywhere. And it's like the women are just like aimlessly milling around, kind of waiting for a man to come along and interact with them. And then the writer of the article starts concluding or starts asking questions of like, well, where are the men? What happened to them? They used to be around. And so then she continues. And
Well, can I say one thing up front here? Because scroll up just a little bit. I want to point something out here. Because the way she starts this out begins to answer some of her own. Stop right there. Down, right? My gosh, man. All right. She writes this: I spent over a decade behind the curtain of digital desire as the custodian of records for Playboy and its affiliated hardcore properties, including sites like Spice TV. I was responsible for some of the most infringed upon adult content in the world. I worked closely with copyright attorneys and marketing teams to understand exactly what it took to get a man to pay for content he could easily find for free. We knew what worked. We knew how to frame a face, a gesture, a moment of implication, just enough to ignite fantasy and open a wallet. I came to understand in exact terms what cues tempt the average 18 to 36-year-old cis heterosexual man, what drew him in, what kept him coming back. It wasn't intimacy, it wasn't mutuality, it wasn't access, it was access to stimulation, clean, fast, and frictionless. It's like, okay, so let me go ahead and sum this up for you first and foremost. You spent a decade appealing to the most base desires, the negative manifestations of male desire. So you spent a decade, I'm presuming, making a good amount of money, right? Honing a message which would appeal to the worst attributes of male desire. Okay. Sorry, go ahead and continue.
I mean, if actually to that point, if you think about it, you are the reason that the men aren't there anymore in public. Why? Why bother putting in the effort when they can get something for free, or they can pay for something, but then they don't have to actually interact with anybody in person?
Well, let's
so they don't have to listen to a woman nag them.
Well, wait a second. Let's assume that let's assume that there hadn't been this massive change in the way that women interacted with men. Let's just assume that all that happened is that overnight, again, you had easily accessible pornographic material and imagery, right? That again, there's a positive manifestation of male desire and there's a negative manifestation of it. She spent a lot of time focusing on developing the negative manifestation, which is fascinating because, as Tina pointed out in the subtitle, what was it? The curated images. It's like, oh, the ones you helped foster and create and amplify. Okay,
Yeah,
just
like,
checking.
how dare men do exactly what women have been doing forever? And like, what's up with this woman? Basically, she's creating the very problem. Like, she has no,
On the front and back end.
she doesn't even recognize that she had a hand in creating this. It's the same thing with, I always get annoyed with Andrew Tate and the fact that, he's created some of these women that he totally despises. Like, him going and having sex with everybody creates the type of woman he does not respect. And these women who do this create the type of men that they don't respect.
What's
This whole
interesting,
article can really be summed up by why is this person that I'm hitting in the face and saying, why are you hitting yourself, not want to hang out with me?
Yeah, exactly.
well, Andrea, on that point, Andrea, on that point, what's so interesting about this is that she's also complaining about the consequences of a movement, an ideology, feminism, that has driven men away from the public sphere at the same time that she was profiting on the, kind of on the back end through her career on cultivating the type of men that didn't really have a desire to go out there and interact with women because they could get their cheap fix through other means. And so, like, she has this paragraph in here where she talks about, like, not so long ago, even a one-night stand might end up with tingled limbs and a shared breakfast. But then she complains about how even that's disappearing, and we've built so many boundaries that we've walled off the very moments that make connection memorable.
Hashtag me too.
You know,
Like, are you serious? It's like,
Yeah,
so
that regret equals rape all the time.
oh, but it gets worse. It gets worse. It's not about blaming men. Well, that's a change in the tone. Like, I mean, my entire lifetime, it's been about blaming men, right? Like, without exception, it's always men are trash, right? You know, all men are this, all men are that. I remember the Me Too era in like 2017, all the hashtags. Back then it was Twitter, right?
But even still, it's not. She's not positing this idea that we created this monster. She's positing the idea of, we're not blaming you. You're just ill. You're just a victim of your own stuff. Like, it's still your fault.
Well, wait a second, because we need to get to more of this article before we like come to a lot of conclusions. But initially, keep in mind, she essentially worked in pornography. The author of this article, she worked in pornography, and then she sits there and she spends another paragraph and a half extolling the virtues of hookup culture.
Yeah.
Right. So she's a pornographer, or she worked in that industry, and she's praising hookup culture, and then she goes this. Like you said, it's not about blaming him, and it's about noticing the imbalance, about grieving what's not meeting us, about refusing to dress it up as personal failure when it's actually a collective reality. So here's what I'll say. You are missed, not just by me, but by the world you once helped shape. Okay, moving on. We remember you, the version of you that lingered at the table, that laughed from the chest, that asked questions and waited for the answers, that touched without taking, that listened, really listened when a woman spoke. You are not gone, but your presence is thinning in restaurants and friendships and the slow rituals of a romantic emergence. It's like there's absolutely no connection here. There's actually no connection between her own life spent in an industry which was determined about trying to give men cheap thrills without actually having to do the things that built strong, emotional, physical, spiritual relationships with another human being. She extols hookup culture, which was the last vestige of the physical interaction, the physical manifestation of the pornographic fantasy that she created.
Yeah.
And she's confused.
You know what this reminds me of? It's like a candy maker that uses all the cheapest possible ingredients, and they make it cheap. They put it on the kids' level, and then now they're complaining about childhood obesity.
Yeah.
And it's like, you've created this problem. You've pushed this. You've made this cheap. You've made it like set off the right kind of dopamine hits in order to create basically this horrible situation.
Yeah. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of every time somebody like Bill Maher complains about wokeism.
Yes. Yeah, you created the conditions for this to thrive, and now and we even warned you that this is the sort of thing that was created, and you laughed.
I mean, you showed me a few months ago, you showed me this clip of, I think it was it Dennis Prager? It was
Dennis Prager.
In 2019, going on Bill Maher's show, talking about the transgender issue with children. And everybody in the crowd was mocking him and laughing at him.
He made the comment. He goes, you got people on the left saying that men can get pregnant. And Bill Maher and his left-wing guests started laughing. No one's saying that. That's ridiculous. That's absurd. That was 2019. 2 years later, you could get canceled for not saying that.
Yep.
Right? It's not like it gradually became popular. Overnight, you could get canceled as a heartless bigot if you weren't professing that men can get pregnant. But the statement here is amazing. You've retreated. She's talking to men. You've retreated, not into malice, okay, but into something softer and harder all at once. Avoidance, exhaustion, and disrepair. And this is the next thing that she says is amazing to me. Maybe no one taught you how to stay. Maybe you tried once and it hurt. Maybe the world told you your role was to provide, to perform, to protect, and never to feel. But here's what's real. We never need you to be perfect. We need you to be with us, not above, not muted, not masked, just with.
Whatever.
My teddy bears are gone. That like seriously, it's like you're supposed to just be an automaton.
Well, my teddy bear that paid for drinks.
Yeah.
A teddy bear that paid for drinks and let me treat him horribly and stuck around while I nagged and belittled and berated and just sucked the soul out of his eyes, and then one day decided that they had enough of that. And why on earth? Where have all the men gone? Where have all the men gone that I have been treating like an absolute just useless, disposable thing that is useful for my own feelings and my own pleasure and nothing else? why don't they want to stick around and be treated that way?
Well,
Because that's
Right.
like the feminism that runs through this entire article. It's just it's hitting all the marks, right? And that's a huge part of it is there's never any personal responsibility in feminism, and there can't be. It must always be. It's not even saying, well, men are just so terrible and evil. You weren't taught, right? If we just taught them better, if it was just educated out of them to be the right way, then everything would be so great. There's no such thing as personal responsibility or accountability in feminism.
You're perpetually a victim of circumstances that are imposed upon you. Zero agency,
yeah.
which also means zero accountability.
Well,
Well, zero agency sometimes. It's like a sliding scale of agency because sometimes women are the boss and they can make anything happen that they want to. It really depends on context as to what level of agency women are given. But
That's
men
definitely true. Yeah.
perpetually, pretty much across the board, are robbed of agency in that kind of a worldview.
So the
Well,
end.
like even in this article, she highlights even at the same time she manages to blame the patriarchy at the same time by being where is that? Basically, it's the portion where she said that let's see.
The world told you your role was to provide, to perform, to protect.
and protect, never to feel. That's her blaming the patriarchy right there.
And never to feel. Like,
I love it when she goes, maybe the world. Oh, really? The world? Like what? The Earth?
Like who?
The Earth came up with this concept.
no,
and decided to
what I
tell us?
actually love about this is trivializing it, because in a way she's actually right if you think about it. The world did tell men to provide, to protect, to perform and to protect. And by abdicating those roles and by forcing the abdication, feminism has not just deconstructed men, it's deconstructed society itself.
And it robbed
It's
him of his
not-
purpose.
It's not an arbitrary element of existence that men exist to do these things. And by not doing those things, you're not going to make men better men. You're just going to make everybody poor off as a consequence of that.
Well, it's an interesting. This is something that I can't quite articulate it as well as I would like to, but there does seem to be this idea that whenever you see this like humanist viewpoint of just like loving you for you, what the hell does that mean? Like honestly, what does that mean, loving you for you? Like from the Christian worldview, I recognize the concept of everyone made in the image of God, which comes with a certain degree of inherent worth. But then your actions and your purpose is what really kind of defines you as you go throughout life. So when you say like, oh, maybe you thought your only job was to protect and provide, it's like, what? Don't call it my only job as if it's flippant or something that I don't get a great deal of meaning or proper pride in doing. Right? Protecting and providing is, like you said, it's an essential role that men play within civilization that helps make civilization possible. So you're right. It's not the only things which should define a man, but they're pretty important things.
Well, there's also this idea that that's permeating throughout the feminist culture is this idea that if you have to earn love in any way, it's not really love.
Yeah.
Like if love is conditional in any way, then it's not really love, which doesn't make any sense because human beings are not capable of fully unconditional love. Only God is capable of that. And so any type of, I'm not going to love somebody who is mean or who is manipulative or who has sort of toxic, narcissistic traits. It is hard to love someone like that.
Well, you see this all the time.
And the idea that it's like, you should love me no matter what, anyway, no matter these conditions. And it's like, no, sometimes you're not deserving of love. The idea that everybody is deserving of love is a farce. Everybody is not.
It's a category error.
Yeah.
It's a category because everybody's deserving of love insofar as that they are made in the image of God and have that in our very being inherent to us. Every single human being is in some ways equally unworthy of love and yet still able to receive it and give it. But it's a category error of everyone is deserving of love in that we are all fallen, sinful human beings and need to love one another as we're all in the same condition. That is different than the individual relationships and the way in which we engage in love with one another
Right.
on
And
a personal level.
absolutely.
Well-
I think that also the fact that we did not deserve the type of love Christ gave is hugely significant. And it's and when we try to sort of pretend that everybody has all this worth outside of God, God is the only one who gives us the worth. But I mean,
Well, I think that, look, so from a philosophical standpoint, it's actually, it almost seems like a perversion of what we might call the grace principle, right? Because the whole concept of like, there's a difference between mercy and grace, right? Mercy is you not getting what should have happened to you. Grace is you getting something you didn't deserve. And it's this concept of, if you can't take me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. And there's an element of that I think all of us appreciate. I mean, think about when you do your marriage vows, right? For better or for worse. It's this idea that I'm making this lifelong commitment to this other person that I love. I'm committing to them through better and worse, sickness and health. And so we get that. It makes sense. But again, it has to be properly understood. It's not for better or for worse. So now I can do anything I want to you, against you, or whatever. And if you don't take it, you've broken your word to me. It's this idea of, it's the idea of, if you're the sort of person that is willing to take advantage of another person that has been willing to commit and love to you, what does that say about the sort of person you are?
right.
And so it's obviously understandable for someone to seek that kind of love, which we might describe as unconditional, or at least long-lasting and long-suffering. It's understandable to desire that. But what's fascinating is the people that we have this inherent desire for it, but then what do people do to actually try to attain it? And the idea is that when you've received that kind of love, it's supposed to change the kind of person you are. Not leave you stuck in the same place where now I can take advantage of it. But
Right.
I
It
don't want to get
reminds
too
me-
far off on this.
I just want to take you a little further off on this real quick. One time Justin Waller made the statement that basically, it's not a direct quote, but he basically said that if the woman who loves him would leave him or stop loving him just because he slept with another woman, she doesn't really love him.
Yeah,
And I'm going, like, my brain just explodes because I don't understand the idea that a person, if you love someone, you should endure all kinds of abuse or all kinds of treatment that is degrading.
Yeah. Well, so again, she goes through this article, and I think we all agree there's like zero self-awareness, and I don't just mean zero self-awareness philosophically, right? I mean zero self-awareness for her life specifically. Like, she engaged in the industries and she engaged in the behaviors which actually fostered the environment that is driving men away. And not only does she take zero responsibility for any of that activity, she now wants to hold out this olive branch without ever having discussed any of the reasons for why this happened. It's a total mystery to her.
But at the same time, there is a realization that something has gone wrong.
There's a problem. Yeah.
Even though, like you said, there's no accountability. There's zero, self-awareness, no introspection on, well, maybe it's me and my philosophy and my worldview
something's wrong with him
that has contributed to this problem. But I mean, let's give credit where credit is due. The first step to fixing a problem is admitting you have one. And we have kind of reached a milestone in a way, because for a long time, the feminist movement, or women like her, had, no comments to say whatsoever in terms of the state of men. It was just, men are trash. I hate all men.
Yeah.
Men are bad.
And no interest in their problems.
The moment,
like Shuan Head is a perfect example of this, who started off as definitely a left-wing feminist YouTube page. And the moment she had the audacity to say, hey, what's wrong with men? Like, you look at the comments section, and they weren't just frustrated that she asked the question.
No, it was like almost genocidal rage.
They were
directed
furious
at men.
that she asked the question. Like, who cares what's wrong with men? I hope they're suffering. Like, these were actual comments. We're not making this up. Now, here's my question. And this is something that, again, it's one of the reasons why I have Andrea on today. Why the hostility? Like, I understand some of the feminist narrative, and we've talked about this before. And again, I have gotten raked over the coals for using the term modern feminism. But the real question here is, if even the feminists are starting to recognize that there's a problem, do they actually recognize the origin of it?
So I would say decidedly not. And I would actually disagree slightly with Christian that we're reaching a milestone that feminists are finally, realizing that there's a problem with men. I actually see this more as, we've gone back and forth before that all the men going their own way and Andrew Tate and Waller and all those guys, that's fifth wave feminism. It's not a reaction. It's the same ideology, just in the next step. And I would say that, stuff like this, you see these articles, you are starting to see a lot more content like this where feminists are realizing, hey, something has gone wrong and there's all these problems. And yet there is no backtracking. There's no actually looking at how did we potentially get here. They're doubling and tripling down on all of the same bad principles that brought us here. They are continuing to buy in lock, stock, and barrel to the ideology. It just starts to change as far as the context and what that looks like, but the principles haven't changed. There's no responsibility, there's no accountability. They're not looking at their own actions saying, maybe this entire worldview that we have built of men versus women, of this perpetual conflict in relationship where we have a complete misunderstanding of human nature itself. There's no examining any of that. It's all the same principles. It's just morphing into the next phase of what that looks like.
So let's look at that for a second, because the first thing we did was the New York Times article kind of explained, okay, they've at least somebody's acknowledged something is going on, but maybe they haven't properly defined it. But like you leveled out a lot of accusations there about the worldview, about feminism, so we got a couple more links up here that we're going to look at to kind of try to see how this manifests itself. And again, one of these, which is kind of a pillar of feminism, is this whole idea of, domestic abuse and men being violent. And this is why we've needed all of these various protections. And that's something that, again, as a guy that believes that men should protect women, I'm sympathetic to the argument that, yeah, if you're laying hands on a woman, you should get beat. Right. But then you see studies like this coming out talking about gender differences and aggression-related responses on EEG and ECG. So, take us through this a little bit about what is it actually explaining?
So, long story short, this is demonstrating that there are real differences between how men and women handle aggression. And you don't really need to be Jordan Peterson or have a PhD and do a peer-reviewed scientific study to understand this.
Yeah.
But the reason that we have this up here is to show that no, there is clinical evidence that show that men and women deal with these type of things in different ways. The stereotype, which is true, is that men typically confront conflict with aggression, like physical aggression. Mm-hmm. So you have the risk of things escalating into violence if it really gets to that point. Whereas women really resort to, and this leads to the next link, to GSR.
Yeah.
Right. So it's actually
gossiping, shaming, rallying, and what's the
there's a longer form of it.
There's M
there's
now.
GSRRM and RRGSM. It keeps getting longer because people realize that actually there's another word that you can tack onto it. So what GSR is, or GSRRM, is gossiping, shaming, rallying, ridicule, moralizing, pathologizing, undermining, and reputation destruction, for the purpose of solving for face or consent. So again, remember when I said that men typically deal with conflict in okay, let's take this outside and settle this like men. Well, women typically, and Jordan Peterson talks about this at times, usually women don't have that option. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you see women fighting other women, but usually they don't. So what they do instead is, I will destroy your life. Mm-hmm. I will, this is effectively why women end up taking over things like HR departments. This is why you see women increasingly being the ones that staff things like DEI positions. This is why women tend to be more the censorist types. This is also why when you look at opinion polling, you see that women are the ones that say things like, well, I don't really believe in freedom of speech if it offends somebody. Mm-hmm. Or, I believe that we need to,
Well, let me slow you down here just for a second, because whenever we recognize something like this, when you see somebody that has a power deficit, in the form of physical prowess. Like, I cannot beat you up. You can say even with men, right? If you have the bullies who are physically stronger beating up the kid at school or whatnot, at some point that kid might find a way to retaliate. Maybe it's getting him in trouble with the principal. Maybe it's doing something else. Maybe it's doing something that is actually physically violent, but they get themselves an instrument that allows them to even out the odds a little bit. But it's not as if these techniques are exclusive to women. It's the idea of what's your primary tool that you pick up when you engage in a kind of fight. And again, for women, because physical conflict is less likely to manifest itself between female on female violence, then the question, or aggression, the question is how does it manifest itself? This is the question that Jordan Peterson asked to that one interview that's now become famous, where he goes, it's not me just saying this. It's what the clinical psychology shows. It's what the research shows, is that unless you believe women just are not aggressive, which I don't think anybody believes that, then you're going to have to ask yourself, if the aggression doesn't manifest itself in physical violence, how does it manifest?
I think it actually goes a little bit deeper than that. If you look into some of the research that is out there, it's not exclusively that, well, women don't have as much opportunity for physical violence or aggression. Like, aggression can be displayed in a variety of different ways. And I think there's some broad patterns that you can recognize of men handle aggression in ways other than physical violence, but are less likely to engage in some of these more verbal and emotional behaviors. And that doesn't mean that men don't ever engage in them and women don't ever engage in physical violence. What this is looking at is really just broad trends of, we can see that there is a behavior difference here between the two genders, and we've got the same basic human trait of aggression being displayed in relatively different ways. And I think that's also, like Christian was getting to, that you see certain industries that tend to be predominantly women and certain industries that tend to be predominantly male. A lot of that is just our natural preferences, how we're made as men and women. But it is very much just broad trends. None of this is like definitive. It's not a female characteristic to gossip. Anybody can gossip. It's just more how we see it expressed in trends. And you do really see in a lot of different social contexts how a lot of these different behaviors that tend to be more displayed by women have become very socially acceptable, whereas the ways that men tend to display these things are very socially unacceptable.
Yeah, they've outlawed dueling, but we haven't abolished the HR department. Yeah. on that point, if you look back throughout history, there was always this sense of honor in fighting for yourself as a man, even if you're defeated. When you look at the Middle Ages, for example, the concept of chivalry entailed that a defeated knight or a noble lord is not actually executed on the spot in the way that you would get like in a total war scenario, like in the 20th century, right? It's just fight to the death. Eastern Front in World War II, there's no chivalry involved there. But when you look at like the Middle Ages, and all the way up until the early modern period, there was always this sense of chivalry within men, even men that fought each other. That a defeated party was treated honorably. They were defeated. They now owed fealty to a different lord. But if you stood up and you fought for yourself, win or lose, there's honor in the act of fighting itself. There's no honor in destroying somebody's reputation, and you also can't come back from that. If you're defeated on the battlefield, you can always come back. As long as you're not dead, you can always restore yourself. You can always regain your honor. But there is no way to achieve that in a situation where that's taken off the table and it's now replaced with, how do you repair your reputation if it's destroyed? How do you restore?
No, I understand that. I think there's also an important point here, is that you will see this before, where you will see women that get into some sort of conflict with one another. There's beef, right? And they never recover from that. You will see men that get into some sort of conflict and then fight it out and actually become friends.
Yeah, like they respect each other more.
It's this weird dichotomy, and I don't know the reason for it. Maybe you guys have an explanation, but I think it, and maybe it comes from the sense that there is a mechanism with temporary consequences, right? The fight. I got a black eye, you got a black eye. We got beat up a little bit, but we can both recover from it. There's, like you said, it's not the same as reputation destruction, where now you have done potentially irreparable damage to me. That's not the same thing in we'll say some sort of physical bout that isn't to the death.
Two examples. Alexander honored Darius with a state funeral
Yeah.
when he recovered his body and buried him as a king, even though they had been
I get
bitter
that,
enemies.
I get that, but they still died.
Another example.
Well, look, I'm bringing it back to modern terms.
I know, but
Okay.
I'm using historical examples because in the modern day we don't have scenarios where men get an opportunity to fight it out that way. That's been removed from the equation, and instead we've replaced it with more feminine elements of battling. So another example where somebody's not dead is the way that Richard the Lionheart and Saladin treated each other.
Yeah.
They respected each other, even though they were actual enemies. They were commanding armies fighting each other in the Middle East.
Mhm.
They exchanged letters. They held each other in high regard as a worthy opponent. There's so many examples throughout the classical period, throughout the Middle Ages, all the way up until the early modern period of men that were Napoleon honored Frederick the Great when he took
we're
Berlin.
even talking about the macro examples here. It used to be in my dad's high school. If two boys got in a fight, they went to the gym, they both got boxing gloves, and then they engaged in a fight in the ring. Right? Like the gym teacher took them like, all right, you want to go fight? You're going to fight here. And that was considered perfectly acceptable.
That would never be acceptable today.
Oh, no, of course not. There'd be lawsuits, right? There'd be lawsuits because it's been determined that this is the way that, again, talking about it and discussing your problems, this is the moral and the preferred way to solve one's problems. We don't resort to violence. And the end result is that, okay, kids are still resorting to violence in many cases. The difference is now is they're shooting up their school. Right. Or you see the sort of thing, too, where it engages in character assassination. Here's what I want to ask, though. All right. Let's get away from Napoleon and Alexander the Great for a second. What is the positive way that women, like, again, if the quote unquote, we'll say positive or at the very least destructive way that men deal with aggression is we put on the boxing gloves, we fight it out, then we shake hands and we say, hey, you know what? Even we disagreed, you're both willing to stand up like a man and duke it out, right? Or whatever it is. What is the positive manifestation of female aggression?
I feel like there isn't one.
I would slightly disagree.
Okay.
And this might be a bit of a hot take for all the people who, know I hate feminism, but there are positive and negative ways that men can display aggression as violence, and there are positive and negative ways that women can display aggression through more communication and emotion-based avenues. We give it the names of things like gossiping and shaming, but when you think about it, underlying that is that women, again, on average, this is broad strokes, tend to work through things in a more through talking about it, through working through more emotion, more relationship and connective type avenues. That doesn't need to be bad. That doesn't need to be gossiping or shaming. We give it those names because that's kind of what we see, and I think that's absolutely what's dominant in our culture. Like, it's just everywhere, and it drives me insane. But it doesn't have to be that. You can work through things in a positive way by starting with that more relational aspect.
So
right. The gossiping is talking about the situation to a third party.
Yeah.
Whereas, but you're kind of positing the idea that the talking, as long as it's to the person that you have the grievance with, sometimes you can work through these things. A lot of times, I would say that's probably true, because I do know that there are times, even like amongst friends, where you might disagree about something, but you can talk through it and get on the same page again with each other.
Well, it feels like, well, this is another thing that's interesting to me, and maybe you guys can clarify on this. So again, the positive manifestation of women dealing with aggression is essentially usually verbal confrontation with the person you have an issue with. So you go to that person, you have the verbal confrontation, but that's how you work it out. And maybe you could also say that one of the things that women are more comfortable with doing in that particular situation is, it talks a lot about men focus on the facts of the circumstances that happened that led to X, Y, and Z. Women will oftentimes focus, and I don't think this is a negative, by the way. Women will all the time focus on how various things made them feel. And so theoretically, the positive manifestation of female aggression is, I had a problem with you. I'm not gossiping. I'm not trying to shame. I'm not trying to rally other people to my side. I'm going directly to you. But unlike men who are now going to duke it out, we're actually going to sit here and we're going to go down this rabbit hole and we're going to figure out why this had the impact that it did and talk about how we resolve it.
But oftentimes, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, Andrea, or not, but oftentimes depending on the woman, I know for me, it takes me quite a bit to get to the point where I think a confrontation needs to be had.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, everything I do is just completely mental. Like not mental as in crazy, but mentally, when somebody shows themselves to be a certain way, I put them mentally into a category and I deal with them now based on the category they're in. And maybe that's a bad manifestation. That might not be good. But there are times when sometimes I view something someone did and the person themselves as not being worth having the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that sounds really bad, but I've been in some situations where I don't have any desire to talk this through with this person. All I know is that person has shown that they're unhinged. And now they go into this unhinged category and I don't have to think about anything they say anymore because they're not worth it. And I don't know, like, where does that fall into this equation?
I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, I definitely am similar in some ways, but if we're talking about the positive manifestation of it, I think you almost have to zoom out a little bit further still of it's not just that I'm not gossiping and I'm not shaming. I think the positive attribute there is that women work through, again, broad strokes on average. If you are focused on communicating, on relationship, on those emotional connections, you're a lot more likely to deal with those things on an ongoing basis and not just let things boil over to a point where you are now, it's not just aggression, now it's anger and a confrontation and this big issue, which, I mean, obviously both men and women do that all the time, part of human nature. But if we're talking about like the positive and negative ways that can work,
Right.
there are negative ways where women can wait and bottle that up and hold it in, and same with men. It's just probably going to look different when it finally comes out. But the actual like principle underneath that of communicating and wanting that more emotional relationship type behavior that women often engage in. There's a lot of different ways that can be positive and negative, I think.
Right.
Do you think there's also something to be said for the fact, because when you talk, I know one of the things I had Misha Tate, who's interestingly enough a female UFC fighter, right? And we were talking about dynamics between men and women, and she was the first woman that I have ever been interviewed by or talked to in that capacity, like a podcast capacity, that looked at me and said, "What do men want? Like, what do men need?" Like, we've talked a lot about what women need. What do men need? It was like, oh wow, okay, well, and I laid out a few things, and I did some content on it, and a lot of the men in the comments said, yeah, I totally agree with you. You left out one thing, because I talked about things like respect, love, appreciation, desire, and they're like, you forgot one thing: peace. We want peace. And now I think there's something to this when we talk about this whole idea about how men and women manifest aggression. Again, because men have a mechanism for manifesting aggression in a way that doesn't lead to permanent character assassination, which is to say it's easy to recover from, right? There's a difference between you and I going to war and a punitive expedition, right? Like, we had a fight, we're fine now, and we can move on. And in fact, maybe we're respecting each other more from the experience. Whereas women, it's harder to have that kind of outlet, physical outlet. Do you think there's something to be said that one of the strengths that women have often provided to an environment is to actually bring peace to an environment where men might be more prone to engage in aggression because we have that outlet? Women focused a lot of their attention, like on creating a peaceful environment, creating a nurturing environment, to where there was the possibility of maybe letting something go or something not going to a violent end state, because there was this alternative.
Well, women were called homemakers historically for a reason, not home wreckers.
Well, I do think that there is an element of being able to defuse a situation that I think that we do possess. I think women are capable of a lot of empathy. And as long as, okay, so I feel like society has kind of morphed women out of this, but I think that it is something that is natural to our nature if we would
Embrace it.
embrace it. Yeah. So the idea of being able to put yourself in that person's shoes and try to understand their experience in order to put everything in perspective and know why they did what they did, or at least understand the mindset behind whatever they did. Sometimes that can put you on a footing where you have a lot more of a forgiving spirit about it than you would if you were just looking at the offense. And so I do think that women do have a unique ability to make bridges and sort of bridge gaps. I notice it actually with you a lot, Nick. As a legislator, a lot of times there would be people that would have beef with you because they perceived that, you were not at the thing they wanted you at, or that they wrongly thought you believed something you didn't really believe or whatever. And I have seen many, many times where I've been able to talk to the person and smooth it over and create a bridge there that didn't exist before. We've had a bunch of those kind of situations. And so I do think us women are able to do that type of thing, but something about not being able to take accountability and not being able to recognize when we are at fault or wrong has kind of messed that up for us.
Well, I want to go into some of the root causes here, but I think the thing that I've been trying to mull over in my mind is there something to the fact that the reason why women, generally speaking, don't have the same outlets for aggression is because there's something about femininity that was actually meant to bring peace.
I would agree, but I would actually go further than that. I think that what Tina was saying is right in a lot of ways, that women do have a unique ability in many ways to speak into that. But I think men also have a unique ability to speak into that. It's just a different unique ability. There's no such thing as a house that has peace when both parties are not working towards that. Men are every bit as capable of ruining the peace of a home as women are. They're just going to do it in different ways.
Oh,
Yep.
I would even
Absolutely.
say a lot of the ways that you see a man, the typical way you see a man destroy a home is either through physical or mental abuse or leaving, right? And we have plenty of examples of that. The way that you generally see a woman destroy a home is through robbing the peace in different ways. Maybe it's also leaving or infidelity, but a lot of times it's just creating an atmosphere where nothing's good enough, or but
or like the person, they're on both sides. You definitely see situations where men or women could have everybody walking on eggshells, worried about setting them off. Men usually it's an anger issue, or like a general like curmudgeon-y grumpiness, anger. For women, a lot of times it's like a coldness.
Or it's withholding or whatever. But I think that, again, the only point I'm saying is that I feel like something might have been lost. We talked about this earlier on the whole idea of like, don't minimize my role to protect or provide as being somehow, oh, that's not just who you are. No, but it's a big part and I take pride in it.
Right.
And I think that once upon a time, there was a reasonable amount of pride that women took in being the ones that could calm a situation, that could bring peace to an otherwise volatile situation. Like I can say right now, there are times where I can be furious, and all it takes is for Tina to come over and just like put her hand on my shoulder or my back or whatever, and all of a sudden, like the entire, everything chills out, right? Everything calms down as a result of that. And it's almost as like in this push to drive women to more masculine attributes, they diminish the feminine attributes were actually really important to this equation. Something that women should have been able to take pride in their capability of having this unique capability, was now denigrated because, well, it's not the same as male aggression, and male aggression dominates and it fights and it conquers. And okay, but nobody wants to live in a state of perpetual dominating and conquering, and people really want to live in peace. The aggression, the domination, the conquering, that's what you do to achieve the peace. But women were uniquely capable of making that peace worth fighting for. And now
So-
I feel like we've told women, no, that's not as cool as what the boys are doing. You need to be able to do what the boys are doing. And that kind of leads me into this next part of, okay, so what's the cause of all this?
So there's something there that I think is important to address. I would disagree that feminism pushes women towards more masculine attributes. It's easy to think that because superficially it looks that way a lot, right? Like things are being elevated for women socially, that you should do these things that we typically associate with men. And you see the opposite of that, where people argue that, men are being more feminine and more feminized and being pushed to reject those more masculine things. But it really goes a lot deeper than that. Feminism is a lie and it subverts. It's not that it's pushing women to be more masculine, it is pushing women to be less virtuous and less feminine. It is pushing men to be less virtuous and less masculine. It doesn't matter whether that actually manifests in being more visibly like a man or a woman. It really doesn't come down to that at all. What it is a lie, and it is pushing people away from whatever their nature is. It doesn't matter if it's men, it doesn't matter if it's women, it doesn't matter if it's adults or children. It always leads to subversion. It is pushing away from what we are designed and made to be,
So, well, let me ask
whatever that looks like.
Let me
That
ask you
makes sense.
Let me ask you this question, because that's a really interesting way to put it. So let me ask you this question: If you had to steel man the argument for feminism, if you had to put it in the best possible light that you could, how would you define feminism? And then I'm going to let you define it based off of what you really think it is.
Well, the common cultural parlance is that feminism is simply a fight for equality between the sexes. They want women to have legal rights, they want women to be educated, and they want women to be protected from the predations of men. That's what most people associate with feminism. They associate it heavily with the women's rights movement, with gaining the right to vote, with legal protections, and with education. It is primarily projected in the zeitgeist as equality between the sexes.
Okay, now what is it really?
Hold on. There was one more thing, and that is the I agree with all of that. There's one more thing missing, and that is the right to decide whether you're a mother or not, even after you've become a mother, if that makes sense.
Interestingly, that is one of the only
reproductive.
features of feminism that does not go back to the founding. And
Yeah.
I am harsh with the founding, as y'all know.
Yeah.
I do not pull any punches with old Wollstonecraft there. No French Revolution sympathy from me, but that is one of the only things that has become a pillar of feminism in later years that was not there originally.
So
Okay,
we
so
could
when-
actually call it.
Well, wait.
Modern
Let's.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
So when we get that's an attribute of the modern manifestation of feminism. Okay, but so that's the kind of like the popular definition, what people generally associate it with, and most people would look at everything you just described and said, what's the problem? I mean, clearly there were issues. Women couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. They were second-class citizens to their husbands, blah, 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 all the stuff, right? And some of it real, maybe some of it requiring some more context, but that doesn't seem like an offensive ideology destroying, the things that bind us within civilization. Now give us Andrea's definition of feminism.
So here's how I like to describe it to people. This is the kindergarten explanation of feminism. I'm unhappy. That person seems happy. I want what that person has. You should treat me like them.
Okay.
With an extra component there that's critically important, that is, I want to be able to do whatever I want without consequences.
Okay. So that's
That
the
is
accountability
really-
argument.
That is really foundational. You'd look at feminism throughout any time period, any of the leaders, any of the written stuff that we look back on as shaping the movement, as creating the ideology. There is a through line from 18th century to today. I want to do whatever I want without consequences, including those of nature and creation itself.
Okay. So to that point, there's this line from the movie As Good as It Gets with Helen Hunt and Jack Nicholson. And Jack Nicholson is kind of this, I guess, kind of autistic or Asperger's, or there's something there, socially awkward in the extreme. But he writes these like romance novels. And there's this scene in the movie where a woman walks up to him and goes, "Oh my gosh, I love your book so much. How do you write women so well?" And Jack Nicholson looks her dead in the eyes and goes, "I take a man and I remove reason and accountability." And it's like, oh, dang. But what you just said, right? This aspect of the beating heart of feminism is I want to be able to do whatever I want, regardless, not just of what society tells me, but what like the physical boundaries of nature tell me. Okay, well, wanting to do whatever you want without being bound by either physical laws or societal rules is the very definition of a lack of a, well, it's the very definition. I was really going through a thing there. It's the very definition of a lack of accountability, right? Or reason. Because to say I don't want the consequences of my actions is to deny, both reason and accountability. So what makes you say that? Like what makes you say that this was not just about wanting the vote. This was not just about wanting to be able to get a credit card without my husband's permission, right? Like why do you say that no, this was essential? It was baked in to the very beginning of this movement.
So this is like my Austro-Hungarian Navy. This is what I have obsessively researched for so many years.
Yeah.
Right?
So for those of you who don't know, like Christian wrote like his entire like dissertation on the Austro-Hungarian Navy during World War I. So Christian has a unique way to obsess about that particular topic. So this is Andrea's Austro-Hungarian Navy. Go ahead.
Exactly. So if you go back and look at feminism throughout the ages, some of the questions that I have asked in my quest to destroy all things feminism, it's like, okay, where did this come from? What is fundamental to the ideology and what is incidental? These things aren't particularly easy to define or categorize. When we're talking about an ideology, I kind of liken it to language. Language shapes and morphs over time, and it's a process of communication where we're trying to use words to get an idea from my brain into your brain, and it's not always exactly clear. It's not always super hard lines of what a word might mean or not, but we can still get a good understanding of it. Just because we aren't always able to perfectly categorize it or define it mathematically or quantitatively. It's a little bit fluid, it's a little bit more, esoteric sometimes, but we can gain an understanding of what words mean. I treat ideologies the same way. It's a bit difficult to give, a definitive, quantitative kind of explanation of it's exactly this. Yet we can still gain a good understanding of what something is. I go back and I look and I see, what did these people write? What did these people talk about? What are the things that travel into today that we look back on as influential? And can I go back and look and see, where did these ideas come from? What's actually part of feminism, and what are things that kind of fell away over time that, it's as dramatic as I am and as harsh of language as I use to decry such things, it's not like every single thing any feminist has ever said has been terrible, bad, and evil, and they've never
Sure.
said anything right. So what are the things that are actually foundational to it? And my hypothesis, which is a bold claim, I will grant you, but I think I have the receipts, is that I call feminism, communism, and critical race theory flavored racism the big three bitterness ideologies. I think it begins with bitterness. And I say that because I have gone back and I have read these women. I've read the source material, not what people say about it. I don't want to read books about these people. I've read what they've actually written. And one of the first things that struck me about that is it is dripping in bitterness. There is this anger that other people have something and I want it. There is happy people out there and I'm not happy. I want what they have. So if you go back to 18th century, right, which is where this started and where I think you have through lines straight through from the beginning to today, you see feminism coming out of the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment French Revolution timeframe. right? This is something that people associate it with women's rights movement. The first wave in that terminology is very US focused. It's very focused on suffrage and women's rights, which even that is a little bit of, a retcon of history there, that there's a lot that you could get into even just with that topic of what was it really about, what type of people were involved, what were they actually campaigning for, how relevant was that to suffrage. But that's a little bit, off topic. What I look at when I see what is feminism itself, what is the ideology? It is an understanding of the world. It is a worldview that views human nature in its of itself as conflict. We talk about power dynamics, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of the stuff that you guys have read about. And power dynamics is a phrase that was coined in the 60s, which is essentially the social theory of power dynamics is essentially that all human interaction is governed by power imbalances. And we hear that language everywhere.
Mhm.
And I think most people use it without even realizing it, that things are perpetually looked at through that lens of power imbalances, conflict. I'm gaining something, you're losing something. Everything's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
That is a worldview that shares a lot of different, like a lot of ideologies fit within that. There's a lot of things that came out of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment that share those features. But in feminism in particular, what that tends to look like is men are, oppressive and tyrannical, and women are victims of that. Because if I don't have something, that must mean that you do have something. If I'm gaining something, you're losing it. If you're losing something, I'm gaining it. Everything is looked at through a very transactional lens that essentially pits human relationship in conflict. And I think that's where you see a lot of things throughout feminism in the modern age,
Yeah.
where you can really see that very
What-
clearly, that everything is pitted in that lens of conflict.
No, it's interesting. The way you put that was interesting, and this one specifically with nature, because when Marx talks about conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, capitalism, it's the economic component. But you're saying that this goes down to nature. So is this something where you're saying that kind of your earliest feminist writers and thinkers looked at the power dynamic between men and women, looked at the men predominantly, did the governing within society. To the extent that they either had the power to enforce their will through physical force or through the vote or whatever else it was this idea that nature has put women at a competitive disadvantage, and so therefore nature is the enemy?
Not quite. I don't think it comes through as women are at a disadvantage, because that would be insulting to women.
Yeah.
I think what it comes through as is, look at all the ways that men have taken power from us. Look at all of the ways that men are exerting all of these different things. And it doesn't have to be that way. They're not framing it in terms of this is a must be. They're framing it in terms that I think people will recognize it's a societal imbalance.
It's a social construct.
It's a social construct.
Yeah.
They didn't use that exact language, but they actually use language incredibly similar. That this is essentially a taught behavior. That's one of the reasons why education is so important to all of these different ideologies. Feminism in particular, some of the very first things that sort of coalesced into the feminist movement were all about education, and why, and not just education of women, but specifically universal, mandatory, state-run education
Yeah.
for everyone.
Yeah. Well, and
That's a very particular kind of education.
yeah,
right?
no, it is.
Right, because it's not just about educating women, it's also about educating men out of the behavior, correct?
Well, and it's interesting that
Exactly.
whenever you do talk about education, the only definition of education that they accept is the one that is, the government state-run education predominantly staffed by women. The moment you start talking about even like homeschooling, or you talk about private school, whatnot, all of a sudden, no, that's different. And it doesn't get the same elevated position, regardless of academic outcome, because it's always struck me that because academic outcome is not the ultimate goal here. It's certain social norms that they're using education to achieve. But let me ask you this question. I can only imagine if, again, we're talking 18th century, right? So 1700s, women are looking around going, wait a second, right? Like, I can't hold political office. I can't own property. I can't do all these other things, but men can. And the reason why men can is because they control the power. So if we did change the way that we thought about these things, then education is an obvious way to be able to do that. Well, then we could change society in a way to where women too could have power. What's so wrong with that?
So this is something that I find most people overlook when you're talking about education. It applies to a lot of other things too, but continuing with the example of education. The state is an incredibly special level of authority.
Mhm.
They aren't out there advocating for education of the individual. It's not let's make education more available for more women. Let's make it more socially acceptable. They weren't advocating for let's make, localities more friendly to education. Let's have more families educate their daughters. They're not even talking about, let's let's make this a more socially acceptable thing. You go off to the big city and get educated, which one kind of comment back to something you said earlier. None of those things were normal for women to do, but it's actually a bit of a misnomer that women weren't allowed to do any of those things.
Mhm.
That's just true in certain cases, but if you look at Mary Wollstonecraft, the original feminist, right? The mother of feminism, she was educated. She had a college education. She was active in a merchant trade. She took over from her father. Like, she did all of these things that she claimed women could never do.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a one-off. No, these things weren't common. I'm not trying to pretend that these weren't issues that women faced. Certainly there was a lot of barriers there, but the problem was never that women aren't allowed to do any of these things. It was that it was relatively uncommon, and there were certain prejudices there, and there were certain barriers that were preventing your average woman from doing these things. However, they never advocated for more women getting educated. They never advocated for, changing hearts and minds that you shouldn't be prejudiced against women being educated. They advocated for a very specific thing, and that was universal, mandatory, state run education.
Mm.
And the state is a very special level of authority because they have a worldview. Feminism is based on a worldview that does not allow for, like we were talking about earlier, individual responsibility or anything along those veins. They don't have a biblical worldview where, as individuals, we are all made in the image of God and yet made for relationship. They don't have that worldview at all.
Mhm.
They are looking at things in a very, like, power dynamics is a totalizing worldview. Nobody lives it out to its logical conclusion because you can't. But when you look at the claims that they're making universal claims.
Yeah.
This is how men and women are. This is how human nature is. Education is important because, this is how humans are in and of themselves.
So
And the state is the highest level that you can reasonably reach to change universals. They're not making the
Okay.
argument that women in London need help getting educated, but women in the countryside don't. There's nothing individual or specific about it. Everything gets raised to the level of the universal.
So that
Men are tyrants, women are victims. It's always categorical.
So, okay,
Do
so
you
that's
think that's
that.
a-
Well, wait a second. That's an important distinction because it also ends up going back to the whole Mont and Bailey tactic of debate.
Mhm.
Whereas if feminists had simply said, "Hey, we just want to remove barriers from girls being able to get educated," that would have been something that I think a lot of people probably could have said, "Okay, hey, that makes sense." But instead, it was, "No, I want universal state control education, which will feature these characteristics." And then the moment you say, "Well, I don't want that," whoa, whoa, whoa. All we want is to remove barriers from girls to being able to get an education. It's like, no, no, no. You have a particular prescription and method in which you desire to achieve this thing. And that particular method you've chosen is tied back to this absolutist worldview that has said men and women are this thing, as opposed to just, hey, Sally here should be able to learn how to read.
Well,
Well,
don't
and
you
they
think-
also go ahead.
Sorry, don't you think that also plays into the idea of the dismantling of the family unit and the authority of the family, because a lot of the reasons women would have barriers would be because of the rigid thinking of the family. So let's take that out of their purview and make it so it's no longer their choice, and they have no choice but to go ahead and educate their children out of the worldview that they currently have.
If
That
I
is
could,
definitely part of it. That not only do they have a disrespect for the family, which again, this is why it kind of bothers me when people say feminism is Marxist, because feminism predated Marx by quite a lot. Marxism is feminist. They also had that idea of, very, very little respect for the family, for relational bonds. It People talk about now atomistic individualism, and you actually see a lot of the principles behind that in these Enlightenment and French Revolution ideologies, and that's hugely part of it. But they were also really open and explicit that they didn't want, education to be available. They wanted state-run education specifically designed to educate away all of these differences between the sexes, because they were all environmental and none of it was inherent, none of it was part of human nature. These differences in outcomes, none of it is because human beings are individuals and the human experience is vast and complex. No, there's all these differences mean that there's a problem somewhere and we need to educate people out of it. So we need everyone to go to school, and we need everyone to go to school so that everyone is exposed to the same environment and we can eradicate all of these differences between the sexes.
So
They said that explicitly.
Nick, I want to
Yeah.
build on that for just a moment. Andrea was talking earlier about conflict and power dynamics.
Yeah.
And her and I have had enough conversations that I actually know that's actually a slight ding at me. But I actually want to build on that just a little bit, because I don't actually think that it's entirely true that feminism is simply saying we want to take power away from men and just put it into the hands of women. I actually think
That's
that
not what I said.
I get that. I get that. That's why I said I want to build on what you're saying. I actually think in part, and it gets to exactly what you just pointed out about dissolving the distinction between sexes. I think in reality, the goal is not, we have this idea in terms of our day-to-day politics, identity politics, for example, that there is this, these Marxist feminists are saying, we need to, seize power from the patriarchy and consolidate it into our own hands. And so therefore it's this zero-sum mentality of power dynamics. But in reality, I think that the ultimate goal of feminism is actually to dissolve conflict and dissolve power imbalances, not simply redistribute power from one group to another group. And a perfect example of why I think this is true is look at where feminism has led us. It's ultimately led us into transgenderism. Feminism has given birth to, this is shocking for somebody like J.K. Rowling, who doesn't seem to understand that she is the revolutionary who has given birth to the guillotine that is now coming for her.
Yeah.
Right? She's the, she's a member of the, the Girondins that are like horrified that the revolution that they supported is now turned on them. But and Rowling is actually a perfect example in this, because she's a dyed-in-the-wool feminist. And yet she's also a TERF, right? A trans-exclusionary radical feminist. She's constantly talking about how transgenderism is intruding on women's spaces. But she's the one that supported everything up until that point in the process. Transgenderism is simply the fulfillment of feminism. It is the dissolving of the distinction between men and women, and therefore it is also the attempt to dissolve what they identify as a power imbalance between men and women. And so in a way, what this is attempting to do is to dissolve conflict itself. It is viewing the dynamics between men and women as simply conflict-based. Men hold power over women. They're the oppressors, right? And women are the oppressed. And so it goes back to Andrea's point about how Marxism is in some ways feminist rather than feminism being Marxist. It's using that oppressor dynamic. Well, one of the ways that you might be able to solve that is simply, cold calculating. Therefore, we're going to take power and just wield it in our own hands. And again, on a day-to-day basis,
But they're trying to avoid to be. They don't want to be the oppressors. They want to remove.
They want
the
to
dynamic
dissolve
which creates it.
the very class of oppressed and oppressor, and the very notion of conflict between the side, or just conflict in general. And so what this leads to is eventually, well, how do you achieve the dissolving of conflict? How do you remove your conception of oppressor and oppressor? You dissolve distinctions wherever they're found. And so, of course, we deconstruct the family. Of course, we eliminate the distinction between men and women. Of course, we want men to be more feminine and women to be more masculine, because the ultimate goal is to actually erase gender itself. And if you if you dig deep enough into this, you get this especially in online spaces like Reddit, Discords. If you actually dig deep enough within feminist and transgender movements, what they're really actually advocating for, this is much deeper in the conversation, what they're really advocating for is abolishing gender itself.
So, and this goes to the point where it almost feels like the foundational starting point of all of this. And it's not just feminism. You see it in other ideologies as well. But the common thread is this component of what you might call secular hyper-egalitarianism. So secular in the sense that there is no outside moral entity that is telling us the way things should be.
It's self-referential.
Yeah, we're the ones that will decide us. Like we are the ones we've been waiting for, like all that stuff. And then the other component of it is the egalitarian side is like, and the chief moral universe that we want to live in is the one that where we're all equal. We're all equal value, equal access to resources, equality, everything. And the only way that you can do that, if you're actually trying to, is again eliminating the distinctions. And so, I guess is that part of the argument here? Is that is a fundamental that feminism, as we understand it, is tied to that kind of secular egalitarianism, to where to separate that from feminism is to destroy feminism.
I would say yes and no. You're getting at something that is there, but I don't think that's an accurate description of it. First of all, Christian, deconstruct is a stupid make-believe word, and I'm going to say it every time you say it. Stop using it. The thing that you're getting at that I think is correct is the result. You're looking at the visible thing that we can see. Transgenderism has come from feminism, and we can see how this has come about over time. But I don't think you're correct in the intention. I don't think that's the intention at all, to get rid of conflict or to, erase the oppressor-oppressed dynamic. I think what you see, and again, all the way back to the beginning, through every wave, every influential feminist, this is one of the through lines that everything is really hit on, is this is what God has said about man, and I reject that. And what the practical outworking of that is, I think, what you're talking about, because the practical outworking of taking that kind of a stance is, I am God, and men make terrible gods. So you're looking at the outworkings of all of this, and we can see the consequences of these actions. And as I go back and look at these ideologies and try to see, okay, where did this come from? What's the principles that led to this? And a huge part of it is simply hubris, this arrogance that if people just do what I say, then everybody will get along and everything will be great. If I can order society, if I can just educate people into the right worldview, into the right understanding, then everything will be great. And what you see, when no matter what context that's applied to, no matter what ideology you're talking about, that leads to devastating consequences. Earlier I called feminism a subversive, right? It takes what is good and true and it subverts it. There are these distinctions between men and women, and I don't think it's about making women masculine or men feminism. It's about taking what God has said is true, nature itself. This is how humans are made to be, and saying, no, I don't want to be that. I want this thing over here. And really, a huge part of this, I call them bitterness ideologies, but a huge part of feminism is covetousness, which is a sin, right? It is somebody else has something I want. That man over there is able to do something and that looks fun and I want to be able to do it. I don't think there's really that much thought put into it of, am I trying to disintegrate conflict itself or get rid of oppressors and oppressed? I really don't think it goes that deep. When you read some of these women, it is petty. It is bitter. It is just vicious vitriol of somebody else seems to be having a better time than me, and people aren't treating me the way that I want to be treated. I'm not getting my way. And there's really a lack of thought put into, okay, but are my actions leading to these consequences? Is there something deeper here? Is there something fundamental here? There's really just a rejection of reality itself to say, no, but I don't want it that way. I want it to be this way. And what that leads to are all the consequences that you're looking at and seeing, okay, yeah, we can look back and see this is a very logical conclusion. We can see clearly how these things here led to these things over here. And that makes perfect sense. But I really don't think a lot of people who have that worldview and are in that ideology put that much thought into it.
Well, we're going to talk about the accountability side of this. Yeah, it's kind of like the rebellion against, God's created order, to the rebellion against even reason or logic, and where that factors into the accountability stuff. But where you're not going to hear about this? Probably in your kids' public school. And that's why Tina and I sat down and we actually put together a 12-part series on why we homeschooled. And one of the biggest things that we wanted to do with this entire process is we wanted to kind of debunk some of the myths around homeschooling. Now, it's not all puppy dogs and lollipops. Tina and I are very honest about the struggles, the difficulties, the points where I would come home from work, look at Tina and just see the gleam in her eye and know that she was ready for the kids to be educated anywhere other than our house after what had happened that day. And yet we persevered, went through it, educated all 3 of our children all the way through graduation. And we're here to give you all of that information that we gleaned over 18 years of educating kids at home. And this series is going to be made free to everybody, because we just want people to have it, and we want to get your feedback. We want you to take a look at this, talk about or discuss the things that we went through, that we're sharing with you, and then give us your feedback on, would you like to see more of this? Is there more areas where we could actually engage in this whole discussion about homeschooling, perhaps even providing additional courses, curriculum, and things of that nature that you would find beneficial if this is something you would like to seriously consider? So if you go and sign up in the link in the description, you will get the notification for when this launches on June 30th. You can sign up again. Go to the link in the description, sign up for this, and you're going to get these 12 courses for free. Take a look, read through them, give us your feedback, and you could actually help us kind of direct where we go in the future for providing more resources for parents who maybe you want to homeschool, maybe you just want to be able to provide additional educational resources for your kids to be able to combat some of the things that they're hearing in other educational institutions. So go to the link in the description, check that out. Okay, so as we look at this component with, what were some of the underlining themes, or we can even say foundational themes. And there does seem to be what you described as kind of a rebellion against nature, right? And this kind of goes back to the garden, right? Did God really say, right? That's what the serpent asked Eve. And what Satan was essentially offering Eve in the garden was this idea of, you will become like gods. So if that's kind of at the root of the motivation here, but then there's been a lot of people that have wanted to be God or play God, right? Alexander the Great was not a feminist. But he definitely wanted he believed in this idea of playing God and being God, and if he could control society, wouldn't it be so much better if he was running things? We've seen other people throughout society who have taken on various ideologies, whether it be Marxist, whether it be, just again a quest for power, right? Will to power, Nietzschean, whatever it is. But feminism is distinct in the fact that it's kind of, again, women specifically rebelling against nature, and you think that it's not so grandiose as eventually moving to a day where we just remove the distinctions between men and women and we're all living happily ever after. You actually think that there's some deep-seated bitterness associated with this, and so that begs the question: what's the end state? What's the end game here?
As far as what feminism wants to achieve or says it achieves, or what it actually does achieve?
What it actually, if you were to ask a feminist right now, well, I don't want to go into that because I think we've heard a little bit about what feminists say they want to achieve. But what do you believe this actually logically leads to?
Well, I think it logically leads to what we currently are seeing, which could be a whole different discussion in and of itself, what I call fifth wave feminism, or even better, Uno reverse feminism, where you start seeing men accepting feminism hook, line, and sinker, just swapping the sexes.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you're just going to see that progression continue, because as we go down that path, it doesn't change. The principles haven't changed. The beliefs haven't really changed. All it changes is the context and, the practical outworking of that as we move forward in society. You have this intense bitterness and just rejection of nature as it is made. And this leads to all kinds of consequences. Like, yeah, we can see a through line from feminism to transgenderism, but I mean, it can also lead to all kinds of other things. It's almost like a weird ball of twine where you have all of these different ideologies that have so much crossover and they share so many things, but they all kind of work their way out in different ways and
So-
different manners.
So what is the because again, whenever you're selling somebody on an ideology, there's various ways to do it. One of the ways that Marx did it was through this utopian future where the dictatorship of the proletariat and no government would be needed and there'd be so much abundance that we'd all be, I mean, that's what he used to sell it, right? Now, initially what he used to sell it was these guys are stealing from you. The evil, filthy bourgeoisie is stealing from you, and I'm going to help you get what's rightfully yours by attacking them. And the sort of feminism that I think most men feel like they're experiencing is just that. I'm the bad guy. I'm the subject of all evil. And so you're going to attack me to take from me. And there's plenty of instances that we see this within society where you actually have the law constructed in certain ways to give preferential treatment to women at the expense of men. So that part has manifested itself, right? We're living that. But what do you think is do feminists even offer a utopian end state?
I don't think they do ultimately. I think feminism, it kind of alludes to it where eventually we're all going to be equal and there's going to be so much equality between the sexes, but it's a very kind of elusive idea where, I mean, if you've ever talked to a feminist and you ask what they want out of life, that's a difficult conversation to get through without banging your head against a wall, man. It is rough out here trying to get them to say what they actually want.
Yeah.
And, you point out that, hey, well, you've already achieved all of these things that you say that you want. Women have the right to vote. Women have legal protections. Women have, well, it's, systemic oppression. It's societal
Unconscious bias.
expectations. Exactly. Unconscious bias, all these things. There is no end state ultimately.
No, everything's a good first step.
Yeah. Well, and I think how they sell that ultimately is, feminism is, of all of the ideologies that we are enmeshed in today, one of the oldest, most destructive, and has the highest death toll. It's a good PR campaign.
That's a good
It's
point.
a really
okay,
good
the
PR
highest
campaign.
death toll is an interesting. I have a feeling on how you're justifying that claim. But dig into that a little bit more, because most people, if you ask what ideology is responsible for more death in, we'll say, recent or modern history, they're going to say communism. They're going to say Marxism. Why do you think it's feminism?
Because feminism has a direct conclusion in abortion. There is no argument for abortion that I have ever heard that does not harken back to these exact same principles. And it's interesting that that is one of the only things that was not part of the original sell back in the 1700s, but the worldview that it presents, the things that it claims about human nature. I think it is a logical conclusion of that. And I don't think that we have any concept on a day-to-day basis of just how many human beings are missing from the face of this earth because they were killed in the womb. That's why I say it has the highest death toll.
Do you think the reason why, because it seems like if you look, I mean, you hear about people like Susan B. Anthony and whatnot, which were, big suffragettes who rejected the idea of, abortion. And that's one of the things that certain elements of maybe we'd call right-wing feminism hold up as, no, abortion is not inherent to feminism. Do you think, no, it was always inherent, it was always a desirable end state based off of what they said, they just realized for marketing purposes it wasn't going to sell in the 18th and 19th centuries, or what?
Basically, yes. And even then you had other prominent feminists who were completely on board with it, even back in like the early 1800s. There was definitely a bit of a split there. It's interesting that you say Susan B. Anthony, because you kind of see, as they present the history of feminism, who they choose to hold up and who was really influential. Susan B. Anthony considered herself very, not very influential in feminism. She considered herself devoted to Elizabeth Stanton, who was the champion of the movement, and she was just there to help.
Yeah.
You see some of the less vile people who are held up as these grand standards of, and Susan B. Anthony was not any great shakes herself. She had all kinds of problems that are kind of foundational to feminism in her life as well, but she's definitely one of the more tame examples, right? And you look back and read what they wrote, like Susan B. Anthony didn't write that much. She wasn't very influential in the movement itself. She dedicated decades of her life to being an assistant to Elizabeth Stanton.
So why don't we hear about
Stanton?
Stanton? So why do we hear about Susan B. Anthony and not Stanton?
Because it plays better. And feminism has a great PR game.
But okay, but like specifically, like what, like if I'm looking at Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and from a PR perspective, I'm a feminist PR, advisor.
Yeah, what are the problems with
why am I
Elizabeth
saying, hey, we're going to put Stan, we agree with Stan, but we're going to put her off to the side? Are
Well,
there some examples?
you do see people like Elizabeth Stanton really elevated as well. She's considered one of the greats of first wave feminism. But I think what people respond to is what ends up getting then continued, the stories that people resonate with. Because again, you have to remember that feminists say that what they want is equality between the sexes. There's
Yeah.
nothing dark about this. There's nothing subversive about it. We just want rights. So when you have stories of people like Susan B. Anthony, who was arrested at a poll station completely, and in New York, it was a scandal because her and I believe 12 other women were arrested for trying to go vote. And part of the reason why it was a scandal is because they were convicted without any kind of trial or process. The judge just said, "Yeah, you're guilty," because he was a corrupt judge. That's
Yeah.
part of why it was a scandal. You have a very heartfelt story there of injustice, and she was standing up for this cause that she believed in, and it plays really well, right?
Mhm.
And you see a lot of those kinds of stories throughout history that kind of get played up as far as not necessarily elevated to these are, the great women of feminism who ran the movement, but you see those kind of stories really repeated a lot and really stressed because it looks sympathetic. It's really it
Well,
plays well and people respond to it,
Well,
right? People
arguably it
respond to that.
is. Arguably it
Mhm.
is sympathetic, right? She got arrested without due process of law, and that's something that we shouldn't want to happen, regardless of what the circumstances might be.
Exactly.
Um,
So what do we do about this? I mean, I have my solution, but nobody else seems to be on board with
well,
repeal the 20th century and overturn a lot of the
You wouldn't
political
like that.
consequences of the. I think I would love that
Yeah,
very much.
I don't think you'd like that at
I would
all,
love
sir.
to
well,
repeal the
let's
20th century.
look. But well, you guys can fight about repealing the 20th century later. When it comes to this very specific issue, we started this whole thing off with arguably a very liberated, very left-wing feminist woman who's embraced all of the aspects of feminism, and yet is sitting here going, "Men, we miss you. Where are you?" Right? And okay, she didn't really. She asked a lot of questions with very, very little introspection. So now we're going to do the introspection for her. We're going to say, okay, we're going to take you at your word, feminist. You are wondering why men are gone, and you've posited all these theories we've noticed without asking men any real serious questions, which is about the most feminist thing you could possibly do, right? What gets men back? And the first thing, I'm going to go to Christian first, and without total repeal of the 20th century, Christian, okay, what are some of the things that get Christian back in the game?
What do you mean back in the game?
I mean, just
I was never in the
Just get
game
him
to begin
in the
with.
game.
no, just
No. Like, okay, so to be serious for a minute,
yeah,
I think one of the things is you've got to replace the horizontal leveling effect that has taken place for a couple centuries now on the front of feminism and replace it with a more vertical hierarchy, not in an oppressive way, but certainly in a men have a proper role to play in society and women have a proper role to play in society, and those are complementary to each other.
yeah.
And one cannot replace the other. But that is going to require women voluntarily going back to being feminine rather than trying to be masculine or trying to dissolve these differences between the sexes or trying to push. It's obviously not just women at this point that are pushing transgenderism. There's men doing that as well. To Andrea's point about how you're seeing, this perpetual revolution now play out to the point that even some men are engaging in the same dynamic, just simply swapping terms or labels around.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the way that you solve this problem is, again, you're going to hate the phrase, oh, okay, repeal the 20th century or repeal the Enlightenment, but certainly it needs to be on an individual level, repealing some of the lies and falsehoods that have been fed to you in terms of what's going to get happiness, right? How are you going to find happiness in your life? It's not going to be trying to be something that you're not. It's going to be trying to be the best thing that you already are.
So
And in the case of being a woman, it's not trying to be a man, trying to be a boss girl or whatever. Like, be the best woman that you possibly can be, and you will find men to come alongside you and meet that role. There's a famous quote by Oswald Spengler where he says, "In all times and in all places, the men and women of every culture deserve each other." And I think he was absolutely right when he wrote that.
So so if I could summarize that, what you're essentially saying is that if feminism, and this goes back to Andrea's statement, if feminism really initially starts off with kind of a rebellion against the created order, what you're saying is like, look, there's certain attributes to human nature that are inherent. And it doesn't mean you can't own a business or you can't own property. It doesn't mean those things, but it means there are important distinctions between men and women. There are generalized characteristics between men and women. And when you embrace those and you stop looking at it as a competitive arrangement, but rather as a collaborative or cooperative arrangement, you're going to get much better results.
Yes.
Okay. So let me ask this. I mean, Tina, obviously, like, I know, like, you believe that, right? So Andrea, and you seem to believe this as well, that again, this rebellion against the created order, which seems to be inherent in feminism and along all of its stages, is inherently destructive. How do you convince, like, you're sitting down right now and you're trying, like, if you had to try to convince, let's say an 18-year-old girl who just graduated high school, who has gone through a school system, which is, for better or for worse, perpetuated this notion, but has also sold her on the idea that all this is equality before the sexes. How do you start that conversation with convincing her that no, the very thing you've been taught as that you should swear fealty to and be a part of, how do you begin to convince them that this isn't the way?
Well, I think I would have two separate answers to that question. It depends on the person. And I think they fit primarily into two categories. You have a lot of people who haven't thought very deeply about any of these issues and really truly believe feminism is just about equality between the sexes. And when I start explaining the origins and bring up quotes and actually show them, like, this is what these women said themselves, there are a lot of people that are actually pretty easily convinced by that. You know, I'm on a one woman crusade to destroy feminism in my lifetime, and I've made good progress. All right, it's a strong argument because a lot of people genuinely, they have this very two-dimensional idea in their mind of what feminism is and what it's fighting for, and just showing them, like, this is what you're dealing with. These are the kind of women who started this movement. This is what it's achieved over time. It's not your grandmas in their lace doilies fighting for the right to vote. Like, I don't know your grandma. Maybe she was a great gal. Also, don't underestimate your grandma. Maybe she was ratchet. You know, we don't know. But it's really, walking people through that is a really effective way. And that's one of the reasons why I focus so much on the origins in the first wave, is because if I can take people back to the origins and say, no, it didn't go wrong anywhere. Because a lot of people these days understand that, well, fourth wave feminism has gone too far. you know, But it hasn't changed.
Yeah,
Ultimately, it's still the
it
same
was always
principles.
going to end up there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, this is what it's always been. You can take writings from Elizabeth Stanton, and I could read you her speeches in a university classroom today with a half-shaved head and blue hair, and you would not know the difference on some of them.
So
It is genuinely that similar in
so
some ways.
so the first part is taking someone who, again, has a very, very superficial view of all of this, that is not necessarily dedicated to it. They just culturally, this is the thing
They
to
believe the propaganda.
Yeah, culturally, this
Exactly.
is the thing to believe, but they're willing to hear another side. And when you actually expose from their own writings the truth of what this movement was always about, you found people that can be convinced that, okay, this isn't the way. What was the second one you were going to say?
So that is a large category of people right there that just don't know and aren't particularly invested in it. They haven't thought deeply about it. I would say the second category are people that are actually bought into the ideology. They are kind of on board. This is how they live their life. There's a much higher personal buy-in there that they're not going to be likely swayed by just looking at the history of it, that I can bring up all of these women and their names and what they've said. They're likely to agree with a lot of it.
Mm.
And with that sort of a person, I think you have to start a lot further back. And personally, like, for me, if I'm talking to someone like that, that's coming all the way back to, do you care about what's true?
Yeah.
How do we know what's true? Do
Yeah.
you even believe that you can know if something is true or not? If I can establish that to say, okay, there are things that we can know certain things
Yeah.
are true or false. Let's go from there. How do we determine that? Is there a way that we can weigh this evidence to see, okay, you think feminism is this, I think feminism is this. How do we go back and what do we look at to determine, okay, these are mutually exclusive options. We can't both be right. What kind of evidence are we looking at? What is the standard there? What is the bar? And I would say most people probably aren't going to be receptive to even having that conversation,
Yeah.
but there are going to be some people that you can at least that's not somebody you're going to win over in a conversation, but it is something that you can have that if you have a relationship with that person. I can walk down that path for a while and kind of say, okay, what's does truth exist? How do we determine
Well,
what's true? Is there a way that we can come to some kind of agreement on whether this is true or false and how we see this playing out in the world? But that's a much different process than just somebody who doesn't know.
There's a couple of questions if I could.
yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right. So let's see. Let me get myself back to the right spot here. Loyal to Law says, "Is the answer against feminism the trad wife culture?" I would initially say no. Trad wife culture is just as much of a trend as a lot of other things. It's kind of a fad. I don't necessarily think that fad is going to lead us back. I don't see anything wrong with trad wife culture or anything like that, but it really depends on what's underlying and what's beneath it. And then there's another question directly after that, but I'll let Andrea answer that question about trad wife first.
I would also say no, insofar as like the idea of a trad wife is very much, I think, reaching for something that is true, but it isn't actually the thing that is true. I go back to feminism being subversive. It has taken things that are good and godly and right and subverted them and said, no, we don't want that. The answer to feminism is simply returning to truth. What is true? How has God made us to be? What is our nature? How do we live that out? I don't care. Ultimately, the way we defeat feminism is that we don't care about it. We don't buy in. We opt out and simply stop viewing things through that lens. We reject their ideology and focus on what is true.
I think
there's
think
an idea of if once you've been deceived to have to sort of undeceive yourself and not fall into things again that are of a deceptive nature. There is another question
wait a
once
second.
you're done with that.
I know there's another question. I think here's my issue. Like when I saw the whole trad wife kind of movement thing, I was like, okay, cool. We're at least elevating things that seem to make sense. But then the follow-on question is always, but why? Because if trad wifery is just a rebellion against feminism, but it's not rooted in anything that actually is foundationally true. Because here's the deal. Trad wife can very, very easily fall into fetish.
Right.
And it's like, oh, it's wear this kind of dress, it's do this kind of things, it's make sourdough. It's like, look, nothing inherently wrong with any of those things. I love all of those things. All of those things are great.
Like every guy has a fantasy of some of those
Every
outfits.
guy has a sourdough fantasy.
And, no, some of the outfits that, and it's a whole social media craze.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Instagram girls talk about using those filters
and
again,
that right there
who-
shows you
Yeah.
why it's honestly
there is an authentic version of that, and then
yeah,
there
it's
is
called being a wife.
No,
No,
okay,
it's
stop.
not.
No,
No, it's not.
This is the flippancy that doesn't work for this, right?
No,
There's
an authentic version
Yeah.
of this where the person actually believes, gleans, and gets fulfillment through her positioning in her relationship with God, in her relationship with her spouse. There is an authentic version of that. Then there is a fetishizing version of that really ends up sort of being like, I'm just going to be his fantasy, that will end up causing her to become very empty because her motivation isn't the correct motivation. Like her idea of the type of wife to be isn't necessarily focused on what God would want her to do in that.
Here's the way. Totally agree with that. I think what it comes down to is, again, what people are actually ultimately seeking is a comprehensive and coherent worldview, right? So when you ask the question, is a trad wife, like I'm a Christian, should I be seeking the trad wife? What do you mean by that? If you mean the aesthetic on Instagram, that may be a nice aesthetic. It may be like if Tina was someone that really said, yes, I like this kind of, I like this, it's wonderful, but it's the aesthetic itself doesn't actually provide the worldview. The trad wife aesthetic may be a logical outworking of a particular worldview, but it can't be the worldview itself. When I look at, and here's the great news, Christianity actually provides a picture of femininity. It's called Proverbs 31. And Tina likes to say that the Proverbs 31 woman is one of the most intimidating women she's ever read about in her life, because that woman is feminine and industrious and builds up her home and engages in commerce and raises children. And like there's all of these components with it, to where if you are rooting your idea of femininity within a comprehensive and coherent worldview, right, which Christianity is, right, along with a relationship with God, I don't want to relegate it to just the philosophical, because it's not. Then the trad wife aesthetic may be an outworking of that. But it can't replace it. Yeah, divorced of it.
Otherwise, it becomes a counter initiation, not the real thing.
Yeah,
it's
it
a
just
cheap
becomes
imitation.
cottagecore.
Yeah,
It's just an aesthetic. At that.
I would say it comes down to something a little bit deeper than just like the aesthetic or fetishizing it. I think a lot of people want the effects of a good life, but they aren't living a good life.
Yeah.
So they're trying to copy the conclusion without the cause.
They're LARPing.
Yeah.
This is why I called
Yeah.
it a counter initiation.
Yeah.
It reminds me in a way of the direction that the right, broadly speaking, has a potential to go down, which is a negation of wokeism.
Yeah.
I've joked with you before that, like, okay, that's anything from ISIS to Kim Jong-un's North Korea. They're not woke, but those are not societies. Those aren't, worldviews that we would want to replicate. That's why there's a real danger when you try to revolt against something that you think is cheap and fake and is lacking any sort of meaning, but your act of revolting against it is lacking meaning.
Yeah.
You end up just creating the very problem to replace a previous problem that you had to begin with.
You're just creating a different type of error.
Like there's so many examples, mostly ideologies throughout history that demonstrate this. Marx talks about alienation, so therefore the solution is communism. Total failure, right? Like you have the same thing with anarchism. Is revolting against something that it says is lacking of transcendence. And look at what happens with the anarchist movement in the early 20th century. You get the same thing with fascism. You get the same thing with Marxism. You get the same thing with fundamental Islamism.
Mm-hmm.
Like all of these things are lacking truth in of themselves. And so therefore they're trying to overthrow a system that is corrupted, but they're simply replacing it with another form of corruption.
Yeah.
I have another question. Can I
Oh, yeah, sure.
go ahead and ask it?
Sorry.
Jacob said, if the natural state of women is following godly men, would the solution not be for men to stand up and lead in the church first, show women the way, leaders got to lead?
The answer to that is, of course, yes. But the question is, A, do we have the type of men capable of doing that?
Oh,
and B, do we have the circumstances that will actually allow them to succeed? Because there's a couple ways that men can take charge. And again, one of them is a destructive way, arguably, which is, okay, so, I'm going to, you could take charge in a Genghis Khan type of way.
Right, but that's not what he's positing there.
Let me say this. So I agree with Christian. It's like what he's specifically asking is, we can talk all day long about what we would hope women would do. The question is, but doesn't it require men to actually lead if we have this worldview that men are supposed to be spiritual leaders, et cetera, within their homes, within society, et cetera? I would say unequivocally, yes. This is one of the things that I constantly, I used to have more of this attitude where it was like, look, men, you need to stand up, do your job, blah, blah, blah. And, Christian had this conversation where he's like, I'm so sick of hearing this when there's no recognition of what's actually going on within society. And I came to the realization the Christian was right, that you need to effectively address what's going on. But then the other side of that is, but the only way through it is through it. There is no I don't think there's any possible way we get to the outcome that we're actually desiring by men, quote, going their own way.
And disengaging.
Yeah, if men
disengaging will make it even worse.
If men go their own way and disengage, and it's like, we'll show you, and then when we're gone, then you'll realize how much you missed us, and things will get better. There's a limited utility in that, right? It was
you get this back.
Yes, you get it. It's like, men, where have you gone? Please come back. And to some degree, men may be thinking, see, it's working. We removed ourselves from the situation, and now you're feeling our absence. I would say that has very, very limited utility, because the real problem that you have is when you have generations of men growing up, they're looking for leadership. Men look for leadership. They look for hierarchy. They look for, where are the boundaries? They look for, what is my role? What is my purpose? What am I supposed to do? And if the good men decide, well, I'm going to sit this out until the women realize how much they're going to miss me. Oh, I got news for you, buddy. There's a whole other group of men that are willing to stand up and say, I got an idea. We're stronger. We're bigger. We can take what we want. And it's what Andrea was talking about. It's the inverse. It's like, okay, feminism is the role. No, it's masculinism. We're in charge now. Well, but what about my right? Don't care about your rights. Why? Well, because I can take what I want and you can't. And so that is the other option here. And so if that's the option that you allow a generation of young men to essentially be raised in, well, then by the time you try to get back into the game, big guy, I got news for you. You don't got a place at the table either.
Well, waiting it out, trying to wait it out like that would create a vacuum, and something will fill the vacuum. Because there's a natural order of how things are supposed to be and men are supposed to lead. Him abandoning that post will cause a vacuum.
Yes.
And it won't be a good outcome. Why? Because it will be outside of the order, because he's chosen not to do the order.
Well, here's the other thing to keep in mind. All right. There's a lot of, and this is a Christian concept, right? There's a lot of repentance that needs to take place both among women and men. And so it's one of those things where, okay, men, here's what you're going to see as you start to lead the way that you're supposed to. Here's what you're going to see the moment you start to engage in biblical masculinity. It's not that society in general is going to lift you on their shoulders and carry you through town in a big parade, but you are going to start to see more and more people attracted to it, because there is something inherently attractive about that kind of nobility and masculinity and command presence in the way it's supposed to manifest. And you're even seeing this in the fact that I always say that the surest way feminists don't even buy their own crap is feminist women complaining about, where are all the good men? It's like, you didn't want them. Or even better, why am I only attracted to conservative men? Because they're the ones that are men, right? Because they're the ones that are actually embracing those categories of protect, provide, lead, but to do so, and again, within a moral framework, not a hedonistic framework. So that's my response to that. I mean, Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would have just, I think, a couple final things there as we wrap up. People want to know, how to defeat feminism, and I think there's definitely something to be said for, what Jacob's getting at of men need to lead. What I think ends up happening though is people can end up accepting more of the framing than they realize, and kind of getting stuck in that, well, what do men need to do? What do women need to do? How do we fix it societally? Ultimately, I think it comes down to you can't defeat a lie with another lie, right? How do we defeat lies? With the truth. I believe that the Bible is the truth. Feminism subverts things that God has said is good and right, and tries to twist that. I don't need to defeat feminism by looking at every single thing that I think is feminist and trying to go after these issues. What I need to do is not believe the lie and live my life accordingly. Am I going to see the death of feminism in my lifetime? Dear God, please, yes, I hope. But I don't know. Who knows? Who knows where things are going? I don't have control over that. What it comes down to for me is, yes, men do need to lead. Yes, women need to stop engaging in these practices. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, how are you living your life? What choices are you making? Because I don't have control over anybody else. I can't make anybody else do what I want. I can't make anyone else see the truth. I can make an argument for it. I can do my best to say what is good and right and true, and that's what I try to focus on. But at the end of the day, I don't have control over anyone else's actions. So what I would tell people is, what are you doing? If you're a man, are you living your role well? Are you getting stuck into the truth? Are you trying to live as rightly and in as right relationship with God as you can? Then that's going to look like a lot of different things, but it's going to have positive outcomes. If you are a woman, are you living well? Are you trying to get stuck into the truth? Are you thinking about these things and trying to live out your created nature as best as you can? And I think that also ends up leading into some of the more broader issues that we talk about as far as making the argument for it, the way we treat other people. I think it's a huge issue that women need to hold other women accountable, right? That's a relationship that is unique amongst women that we can do in a way that men can't. Encourage men. If you see someone doing something well, tell them that they're doing well. They don't get a lot of encouragement. Add some. Likewise, if you see women doing something well and you think that they aren't buying into all of this, they are doing a good job, they are living well, tell them, encourage that behavior, discourage the behavior that we don't want to see. If you see women engaging in, gossiping or shaming and all of these things, make sure that they know that that's not acceptable around you. And that's not going to be something that you're just going to sit by and quietly let happen. And at the ultimate thing for me is, you have a choice. We all have the choice whether we buy into this stuff or not, whether we behave accordingly. No one can force me to sin. No one can force me to take any action that is evil in any way. At the end of the day, I have the choice. I get to look life in the face and see, okay, yes, there are real issues here. There's real pain and hurt. And we can be flippant sometimes with kind of the way that we approach these topics. But the reason that this stuff is popular is because there's bits of pieces of truth in there that connect to people, and generally bad experiences that they have had, real life pain is how this stuff gets disseminated and grows so deeply. I have the choice every single day when I wake up, as I go through my day, to look that in the face and choose and say, what kind of person am I going to be? What kind of choice am I going to make? When men wrong me, which is a real thing that happens, how am I going to respond? When I see women engaging in this behavior, what kind of choice am I going to make? Am I going to be that kind of woman? Am And we all ultimately have that choice. It's something that's very unpopular, and a lot of people, especially your more disaffected people on the right, really get angry when you say it. But if you have a nagging wife that is a feminist and is just engaging in all of these bad behaviors, you still have the responsibility as a man and a husband to make the right choice,
Mhm.
to do your job well.
Mhm.
If you are a woman who has a jerk of a husband who is just lazy and has checked out and who hasn't taken seriously all of these duties and responsibilities that he genuinely has, it's still your duty as a woman, as a wife, to do the right thing, to live well, to make those choices. No one can force you into this conflict battle to say that it's men versus women, it's this versus that. We all have the choice.
Well, I'll tell you what, I had one more question, but I'm leaving it at that. In
No,
fact,
I
what
feel
we're
like
going to
that
do.
was a great wrap up.
Yeah, in fact, what we're going to do. Now, I will let the audience know that the question I do plan to ask Andrea and Tina is because we've talked a lot about accountability, but guess what? This question, which is going to be, how do you hold women accountable? How do other women hold each other accountable? We're going to be discussing that in the post game. Now, if you're interested in what the post game is, well, go to the link in the description and consider joining our community, because it turns out before every episode, we have a pregame and a post game where we handle some of these other questions off camera just for our intentional community. So if that's something you're interested in, again, go check out the link in the description. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Andrea, for all of your insight and wisdom today. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you next time.